Professor Simon,
Hmm.
how does it feel being one of the leading figures in moral philosophy? And what have been the main changes in your think from the 17th to the present?
Right. Well, I'm not sure I'm regarded by everyone as a leader in moral philosophy. One thing noticeable is though I've talked a lot about morality, and for example, I wrote the book Ruling Passions, which is all about morality. I've not tended to get into first order moral problems. I don't discuss whether it's permissible to have an abortion or whether liberalism is the right political philosophy. So questions like that in first order political and moral philosophy are not ones I've ever really contributed to, unlike, say, somebody like Tom Nagel or Tim Scanlon. And so I think some moral philosophers would deny that I'm a leading moral philosopher. I'm just a philosopher of language who happens to use morality as a sort of textbook case. But I think I go a bit beyond that because I have talked about Hume versus Kant and things like that. So, and I've talked about moral luck and Bernard Williams and Tom Nagel. So, all right, I am a moral philosopher. Whether I'm a leading one, I don't know. Yeah, how's my thinking changed from the 1970s to the present? When I started thinking about moral philosophy, it was pretty clear, I think, what was meant by realism. Realism was a view about morality. It was a meta view. It was a view that when we moralize, we attempt to describe a moral reality. That's realism. Now, of course, its problem had been since 1903, since G.E. Moore published Principia Ethica, that it faces a dilemma. Are the moral realities which it talks about just natural realities, like, for example, people feeling pleasure or being in pain or animals suffering or whatever it might be, natural features of things? Or is the moral reality something over and above that, something different? Now, G. Moore had argued that it is something different. It's one thing to say that such and such an action causes pain. It's another thing to say it is wrong, because it may be that the person doing the action thinks that the pain is a necessary route to something else or a necessary retribution for something, that it's got a justification. So Moore argued that the property which gave moral realities their nature had to be non-natural. It had to be something else other than the sort of feature that we can observe or know about with the senses. And that's all very well and good, but then what the heck is it? How do we know about it? Why do we care about it? And Moore had to be silent about all that. All he said was that we know it by intuition. So moral realism became, as it were, associated with this mysterious intuition. Now, I didn't like that from the get-go. When I was a student, I think I first refused to believe that Moore had set the issue up correctly, and I tried to do better. And over the 70s, I developed what became known as Quasi-Realism. I now regret that title. It's not very helpful. But the reason I regret it is partly that as the years went by, realism lost a lot of what More and other realists had taken it to be, because it stopped being a theory about ethics and started being simply a way of affirming your first order moral commitments. So if you said there is a moral reality, it would be a way of summing up that I'm against cruelty, I don't like war, I do like people being kind to one another, and so on. All my first order convictions would be summed up by saying that's the moral reality. Perhaps the biggest champion of this kind of deflation of realism was Ronnie Dworkin. Now, Dworkin had something going for him. I think it was a good idea to think that way, but he associated it with a dislike of the alternative, which I had been developing, which became known as expressivism. Alan Gibbard in the United States and I more or less simultaneously developed quasi-realism, and that's what I should probably go on to talk about. But anyhow, the big change in my lifetime, I think, was this sort of gradual hollowing out of the idea of realism. So very few people now who call themselves moral realists think in terms of a sort of higher world, a higher reality. They don't want to think that way. It's not quite clear how they do think, but or why it deserves the title realism. But that's roughly where we are now. And if realism disappears or sort of dissolves, then quasi-realism needs it needs to describe itself differently. So that's my problem at present. I can't think of a better way of putting it. What quasi-realism did when I started thinking about it, and when Alan Gibbard started thinking about it, was essentially defensive. Realists were always apt to say, look, if you follow Hume or you follow Adam Smith, you think of morality in terms of expressions of sentiment. It's all very well, you can express your sentiments. I can tell you how I feel about, cruelty to children or whatever. But you can't talk about the truth. Realists thought the truth was their private property, or facts, or proofs. Proofs, facts, truth, all those good things seem to go along with realism. And what Alan and I set about sort of independently, but together in a way, was to show that that's a bad way of thinking about it, because you could see why moral opinion would take on the appearance of truth, just as you can see why mathematics takes on the appearance of truth, why all our discourses, as soon as they have a propositional form, you can agree with them by saying that's true. So we set about in the 1980s rehabilitating truth for expressivism. And that was the task in those days. Okay, that's enough. Is there any more about?
That's great, Simon. Second question, Professor Simon. What is David Hume's influence on your work?
The main influence on me or my influence on the world?
I think he asked about David Hume's influence on
Yes.
your work. Yeah.
Yes, on my work. Yes. Well, David Hume, as José mentioned, is a major influence. Hume Hume's enemy was rationalism, the view that morality could be known by reason. Now, this was a big target because both Plato and Aristotle had thought that reason gave us, as it were, some kind of entry into moral philosophy. And Hume displaced reason. He said, no, reason has much less to do with it than these people thought. In its place, he put sentiment, how we feel. Morality became essentially a question of how we feel about things. And that is the bit that I've always clung on to. I think Hume was right about that. And of course, one of his main arguments was that morality is practical. But in order to be practical, it has to engage the feelings. It has to engage our desires, likes, dislikes, the things we care about. Those have to swim into the center of the picture. Realists had always put those things to one side in favor of intuition or some kind of proof, some kind of rational knowledge of the good. Hume said, no, you can't put those things to one side, because if you did, you would lose the practical aspect of morality. Whatever else it is, morality is for coming to coordination about how we are to behave, who we're to admire, what kind of actions we're to educate people into wanting and admiring, and so on. So you can't get there without employing sentiments, without engaging the desires. Otherwise, it would just sort of freewheel. It would just be out of gear. It wouldn't matter. How would it matter? Unless you can make somebody feel good about something or bad about something, you haven't really succeeded in any kind of moral persuasion. So Hume quite gleefully attacked the rationalists of his day, people like Wollstonecraft, Samuel Clarke, various more or less forgotten philosophers. But he put his crusade was to put sentiment back in the driving seat. And I thought Hume was absolutely right about that, and that's, as it were, been something I've clung on to ever since.
Great. Well, I think two issues that we may consider very important in philosophy nowadays is the question of mind dependence and the Frege-Geach problem. I'd like to know how quasi-realism may help us with those problems. Yes. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Good. Well, this is another thing on which my thinking has changed a little bit. In the if we take the Frege-Geach problem first, because I think that's the important one. That's where things become very pointed. I think in my first discussions of that, which were in, I think, about 1980, I thought that while Geach was right that, for example, a simple expression of desire or a simple expression of approval of something, which might be, as it were, just saying boo or saying hooray, if you imagine yourself watching a football match, you don't always go propositional. You don't always say that was a good goal or that was a bad pass or whatever. You just say or boo or hooray, yeah, right on. You shake your hands about. So those are the natural expressions of emotion. And Geach rightly pointed out that moral sentences have far more, as it were, logic to them than simple expressions of boo, hooray, things like that. And his famous example was you can, as it were, stick together attitudes, mention of attitudes, so that one supports another or one implies another even. And his famous example was, if lying is wrong, then getting your little brother to lie for you is also wrong. Now, most people, I think, would agree with that. Some people might not. They may say that an indirect lie is somehow less culpable than a direct lie. But I think most people would agree with Geach. But it doesn't matter whether you agree with him about the actual example. What matters is that it's a good example of something which is obviously intelligible. It's something we can discuss, we might want to discuss, and we can see how discussion would go. And Geach thought of this as a refutation of expressivism. If expressivism just said, when you issue a moral judgment, you express an emotion or express an attitude, that would not explain how the vehicle for it, the sentence, behaves in this kind of context. These are called indirect contexts because you don't assert that lying is bad. You don't express any attitude to lying. You just say, if lying is bad, then something else is also bad. And that requires explanation. Well, Gibbard explained it, or presented an explanation in his book, Wise Choices, Apt Feelings, which was in about 1980, I think, in terms of associating plans with one another. So suppose you plan to go to the seaside for a holiday. You say to your partner, let's go to the seaside. And they say yes or no, depending on whether they agree with that plan. And they may want to say something like, well, if we're to go to the seaside, we ought to book a train ticket or whatever it is. And in that case, they're sort of hypothesizing you going to the seaside. And that relates in a rather curious way to the plan to go to the seaside. You're saying, in effect, if that plan is a good one, then we'll go to the seaside. That's the right plan. And again, you need some explanation of what is actually being said. My own suggestion was just a little bit simpler, I think, than Gibbard's, perhaps not so, it was slightly different. I said I like working in terms not of plans, but of attitudes, because after all, a lot of our moralizing is an expression of attitude about things. Most obvious example is if you take a fiction, like, I don't know, do people in Brazil read Jane Austen?
A bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Some. Well, we oldies think that your generation doesn't read anything.
Yeah,
But
pretty much.
anyhow, if you read Jane Austen, you might want to say, God, I really disapprove of, I don't know, Elizabeth Bennet's behavior. Now, you're expressing an attitude to the way Elizabeth Bennet is depicted as behaving, but you're not planning anything. Elizabeth Bennet's a creature of fiction. She's not a real person. She's a creature of Jane Austen's imagination. But you can still approve or disapprove of the way she's presented as behaving. And I found that important because it means that there's a step aside from actual practical planning. I don't plan to do anything about this creature of fiction. But nevertheless, I have an attitude towards her. So I wanted to make attitude central. And then facing Geach's problem, well, can we see why we might think of one attitude as cohering with another? And if we can, then we've got some understanding of what the Geach conditional is about. So going back to Geach's example, if it's wrong to lie, then it's wrong to get your little brother to lie for you. What I'd be saying is, consider the attitude of lying, the approval of lying. If you approve of lying, the disapproval of lying, if you disapprove of lying, then surely you have to, I might say, disapprove of getting other people to tell lies for you. And if somebody says, no, I disapprove of lying, but I don't mind getting other people to lie for me, you might say, well, I'm against that. I think that's a bad combination of attitudes. So we can understand in terms of attitudes only what's going on when you say the Geach conditional. And I thought that was important. It goes with a wider kind of expressivism, which would include a theory of the conditional, the if-then judgment altogether. Whenever you say if P then Q, you're in a sense giving somebody what Ryle called an inference ticket. You're allowing the inference from P to Q, or you're disallowing the combination of P and not Q. You're not saying that if you hold P but not Q, that's bad. And that's a general account of the conditional, which translates over into attitude. So I didn't think the Frege-Geach problem could possibly be lethal for expressivism. It just required a bit more thought, which is what I tried to give it. That's been very contested. Lots of people have written papers saying Simon Blackburn's wrong about this. On the whole, I don't think they're right. I don't think they've got right on their side. I still think I was right about that. If I could just add one thing, in recent years, some people, I'm thinking particularly of a young lady, well, younger than me, a woman called Amy Thomason, who works at Dartmouth College in the USA. She's been following up the linguistics literature, not philosophy, just linguistics. And some linguisticians, people interested in language, have pointed out that the transition from an expression or a command to a sentence, which sounds as though it's expressing a truth, is very common. It's something that is easily done. An example would be this. Suppose a child, one of the things that children quite early on learn to do is express their likes and dislikes. And a child might taste something and say, ugh, bleh, or yuck. Yuck is a very, I don't know, do you have yuck in Portuguese?
Yeah, the eca.
Eca. Oh, okay, eca. It's a bit like, and that's a way of registering its dislike, communicating its dislike to its parents or something. And you might think that's the end of it. But in fact, very quickly, the language will allow the mother, for example, to reply, no, that's not yucky. It's really nice. Get used to it. Or, you know, it's if you think that's yucky, you should try sprouts. So in other words, it becomes treated as if there's a property of yuckiness about. But there's not. It's just an expression of dislike. What the mother's really doing is trying to wean the child away, to trying to show the child that it can improve by learning to like whatever it is. If you keep going, you can learn to like carrots or something. Carrots aren't really yucky. They're quite nice when you get to know them, that sort of thing. And so we've got, it's not really yucky, it is really yucky. And that transformation is very common in languages. It happens too when you start with a verb, and that translates into a noun. So you might start with the activity of dancing. You say, I dance, you dance, he danced, we danced all night, and so on. And then we've very quickly got the noun dances. How many dances? We can count then. How many dances have you been to this year? And you might say, oh, the dance last night was boring, whereas the night before I really enjoyed myself. In other words, we start treating the dance by means of having a noun for it. Whereas really, we can't escape the fact that dancing is an activity. There's no thing involved. There's just people going in for that activity. But then we nominalize that, we make a noun out of it, and treat the noun as the subject of various propositions. You say the dance last night was too long, or the dance last week was much better because the Rolling Stones played, or whatever you say. So this is a very common transition in linguistics. And Thomason has made a special study of the way it applies in expressions of emotion as well, expressions of attitude and feeling about things. So she's a great champion of this kind of approach. And I'm very pleased because it's nice to have people, coming down the same track as I am.
Oh, I have perhaps a silly question. I'd like to know.
I like silly questions.
Why do you think? Why do you think there has been this insistence on like moral realism by the history of thought, since that, or given that the Judeo-Christian God can be seen as a voluntaristic God? He changes a long time, so for me at least, there's this conflict between moral realism and a God that changes his will.
Yes, well, voluntarism, as it's called, is the view that it's God's will which creates right or wrong, duties, obligations, the whole sort of population of ethical thoughts. And that's always had the problem. Then what if God changes his mind? Now, of course, Christians are going to say God never changes. Perhaps he can't change because he's not in time or something. But the whole theory then becomes very hard to understand. And there's a problem about it, which actually was emphasized by the rationalists of the 17th and 18th centuries. They said that if it was just God's will, then you've got what's sometimes called the Euthyphro dilemma. Euthyphro is one of Plato's dialogues. And in it, Socrates meets a young man called Euthyphro, who is on the way to exposing or accusing his own father, of some crime. And the question is whether he's right or wrong to do so. But the main point from the dialogue that people remember is that there seems to be a dilemma. Is accusing your father of a crime, is that good because God says it's good, or does God say it's good because it's good? Which comes first, chicken or the egg?
Yeah.
And if the egg comes first, then it's not so much God's will that's making it good. It's something else, whatever it might be. If the chicken comes first, if God's will comes first, then what's to say that God's willing the right thing? Why is how do you make something good by simply the act of putting a stamp on it? It's obviously modeled on lawmaking in human society. The lawmaker can make something illegal just by putting a stamp on it. He says it's illegal, it becomes illegal. But that doesn't seem to do justice to the thought that morality needs to be objective. It needs to be something that we can be right or wrong about. And it makes sense to ask the question whether God, if he willed this, was willing the right thing. So suppose, to take a case that's very, very contemporary in England, people are worried about assisted dying. It's going to be voted on in the Commons quite shortly. Well, supposing some churchman gets up and says, God forbids you to assist anybody to die, you might say, well, I don't know how you know that. Did God speak to you directly? You're looking it up in a book. But you might also say, I don't care. If he did, then he's a cruel God, because the compassionate course is to help people end their lives if they wish to end their lives and they're sufficiently ill. So saying that God willed it doesn't put it above or outside moral discussion. So voluntarism doesn't really work because, as Moore put it, there's always an open question whether God willed the right thing. And even if you're told that God willed this, that, or the other, you've got perfectly good space to challenge it, to say, well, maybe he did, but maybe he got it wrong. Or after all, the interpretation of God's word happened at particular historical junctures, and perhaps in Palestine in the year zero, It was easy to think one thing or another, in which case you projected it onto God and said God wanted this, that, or the other. And it may be harder to see that now. In other words, a detour through religion doesn't really directly help ethics.
Yeah, by questioning metaphysics perhaps as a foundation for thought, maybe a questionable one, how can we avoid our reasons from being merely arbitrary, or is it a problem at all?
Good. Yes, it's interesting. That became a problem, I think, historically, more or less at the end of the 18th century. It's a problem which arose with the rise of Romanticism in Europe. Because, I mean, if you read Hume or Adam Smith, notions like subjectivity or objectivity don't feature. That's not an issue for them. I think Hume assumed that we're social animals. We don't like idiosyncratic or purely personal commitments. Those aren't the ones. What we want is something to which everybody can sign up. So, to use a famous example of his, if I call somebody my enemy, that's not registering a moral view about them. It's representing a personal view, a subjective view. I hate that person, or perhaps he's done something I disapprove of to me. I resent him in some way. But it's not soliciting the opinion or the agreement of other people. So if you call somebody your enemy, you're not really entering a moral verdict on them. If you call somebody a villain or a criminal or say one of the really bad things you might say about people, then of course you are. So I can make a moral remark. If I say he lies to his wife, I might hope that other people say, oh, yeah, that's not very nice, is it? And chime in with my disapproval. If I say, he beats his children, then that's worse still. And so these are cases where we solicit everybody's agreement. Now, sometimes we don't get everybody's agreement, we get dissent, but the idea is that we're essentially involved in a social verdict, not an idiosyncratic or personal verdict. Now, to be involved in a social verdict or presenting a social verdict, I may have to have done things which society regards as putting me in a good position to talk about it. So, for example, supposing I say then that so-and-so's a horrible man, you say, what makes you say that? Well, if I'm to uphold my place in this conversation, I have to come up with some answer. Oh, I saw him beating his children in the park the other day, or whatever it is, and that puts you in a position to agree with me. But if I just say, oh, I don't know anything about him, but I just feel that way, I'm not entering a reason, I'm not entering a consideration which I can expect to sway you. So in that sense, I'm not in the moral game at all. I'm not in the game of trying to find social coordination. And I think morality is essentially a matter of social coordination. That is, we don't allow purely subjective attitudes or commitments or commands or anything to sway us. And if we're in the game at all, it's a game of giving and asking for reasons for or against something. And a reason against somebody, say is a really bad thing. A reason against somebody has to be something more than purely subjective. Just saying, I dislike him. He gets on my teeth. He's like ice cream or something. That's no good. I don't care about your likes or dislikes if they're purely subjective. But I do care about people being pleasant or unpleasant, nice or nasty, good or bad. But then I want information. I want to know something which is a basis for my saying they're good or bad. So insofar as I need a verdict on something, it can't be purely subjective. It's got to be something which is calculated to appeal to other people. And I think this was, as it were, part of the atmosphere of the 18th century. The 18th century, they didn't have a problem with subjectivity. As I said, the word subjective never occurs in either Hume or Adam Smith, or objective for that matter. For Hume, it's just obvious that entering a moral verdict is entering a social verdict, or trying to solicit a social verdict. And for it to work like that, you've got to produce evidence, which is evidence for everyone. That's the hope, anyhow. So if I say he's a really bad husband, why? Because he cheats on his wife. Well, you may or may not think that's a terrible thing, but I hope you share my distaste for that, and then in that case you've got a piece of evidence that he's a terrible husband. On the other hand, if I just say, well, I don't like him, I haven't done anything to sway your opinion. I may, of course, say something like, I don't know what it is about him, but there's something creepy, I think, or something like that. In which case I'm entering the moral game, but I haven't really got a conclusion. I've just got a hunch, sort of feeling that there's something not quite right about this. Now, of course, feelings are that sort of very important. So, suppose you get a telephone call, and somebody says that they've got this investment opportunity, or that your sisters need some money. Could you send it to her account or whatever? And you may be suspicious. You don't think this call is everything it seems. It may be a scam. It may be some fraud. And then, you get off the phone and you talk to your partner or friend or wife or whoever it is. And you say, I don't know, there just seems something not quite right. There seems something, a bit on edge. I'm going to ring the bank and see that that's all right, or something. So it goes on. So you can, of course, come intuitively, sort of, as you might say, but that means just without really knowing why, to feel that something is off color or something is particularly good. I think more often, if it's a telephone call, you're going to worry about whether it's off color, whether it's not quite everything it seems. And I think that becomes more and more important in the world of AI and virtual realities, because unless you've got a very finely tuned eye or ear, you can easily be taken in. Yeah. Anyhow, that's a digression. The point is that if you're entering you're entering a verdict in the hope of social agreement, you've got to find something which is likely to elicit that agreement, to generate that agreement. And a purely me to him fact doesn't cut it, won't cut it. It's got to be something which you can expect everybody to, or many people, a social problem, to have a social problem with. So I've always thought subjectivity, therefore, is somehow, it's not really a problem. It's slightly different from aesthetics, taste, and go to the picture gallery. It may be enough to say, I don't like it. I don't know what it is, But you'll try and find features which help. It's garish. It's a bit bright. It's a bit, or whatever. It's restless. It wouldn't make me feel at ease. I see the picture behind you is a picture which wouldn't make me feel at ease. And in aesthetics, you're allowed to be idiosyncratic. You're allowed to be subjective. But in ethics, not. In morals, not.
Yeah, one might think in the future, the rising of like a corrupt society, and I may think that if someone in this very corrupt context find your work, how can it like quasi-realism help it to get out of the context, or do you think it's more like the context that solves itself, or I don't know what you think.
Well, I think one thing that I may be able to help with, or my work may have been able to help with, is the kind of skepticism about ethics, which is in the English profession was probably best voiced by John Mackey in a little book called Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong, written in 1977, I think. And indeed, it was partly in opposition to that book that I started writing about Quasi-Realism. Because Mackey thought, he thought that the truth was we were expressing our feelings. That's all that happens. But that moral language took on, as it were, a false cloak of importance, a false cloak of objectivity, a false kind of appearance. And so in and of itself, it implies a mistake. If you think that, you think, oh, well, all moralizing is somehow corrupt. It's something we needn't pay attention to, something we can tiptoe past. The preacher man sits on the corner with a soapbox who stands on, shouting that we must do this, mustn't do that. You just go past, you just don't care. And Mackey thought that was the problem. That ethics was fundamentally mistaken. The whole thing. It wasn't just that you were mistaken in thinking that murdering children is bad. It's you're mistaken whatever you think. It's no better to think that murdering children is bad than it is to think that murdering children is good. They're just equally corrupted by this mistake. I thought that was terrible. I didn't like that at all. I thought we've got to be able to protect the verdict that murdering children is bad, and the verdict that being kind to children is good. So, so I wasn't having anything of that. And insofar as my quasi-realism gave us what we wanted, then I think it did stave off that kind of skepticism about ethics that was voiced by John Mackey. It goes on today. There are still in the English tradition, there are people like Richard Joyce in Australia, and I'm forgetting the name. There's an American author, not Sharon Stone, something like that, but who writes skeptical books about ethics. I think that ethics is a busted flush. It's something we can do without. I think they're very wrong about that. I don't think we can do without ethics, because we can't do without social life. And social life implies a community of attitudes. And insofar as we need to discuss attitudes, we'll use the language of ethics. It's what the language is for. And so there's no point in avoiding it.
Well,
I have some basic questions from the general public. First, what is morality, and what is the correlation between morality and truth? And could you elaborate on your work regarding the conception of truth?
Of truth, yes. Around 1990, in my own history, 1990, I became more and more attracted to what are called deflationist or minimalist views about truth. These views had been about for a century. The first serious deflationist, I think, was the German logician Frege, and then it was taken up by Frank Ramsey, by Quine, very notable philosophers. But it got a very good defense in a little book which was published in 1990 by Paul Horwich, just called Truth. And it's a very good little book, small and very clear, and I think very persuasive. And basically what the deflationist says is there is not a topic of truth as such. When I say truth as such, that means a general topic, what is truth? Instead, you've got to recognize that when you say that something is true, you're simply registering agreement. You're saying, in effect, that goes for me too. Or yeah, I can sign up to that. So suppose somebody comes along and says, John weighs around 85 kilos. And you say, yeah, that's true. Then you're showing that you're signing up to the view that John weighs about 85 kilos. It's your own endorsement of the view that you're uttering. Now, that's a very simple example, and it led some people in the early 20th century, including Ramsey, to talk of the redundancy theory of truth. Because if the only context we've got is you say something and I say yes or no, then there's no more a general problem of truth than there would be about the general problem of yes or general problem of no. The question is this remark true? And then what's he say? He said, John weighs 85 kilos. And you say that's true, then you're agreeing that John weighs 85 kilos. There's no extra content. It being true that John weighs 85 kilos is just the same proposition as John weighs 85 kilos. You can scrub truth from the context. So people thought, well, that makes it redundant. But in that case, isn't it funny that we've got this word? And what's a second generation of logicians, including actually Ramsey, but Horwich explains this very well, started to say was, but not everything we say using the notion of truth admits of that simple sort of just divide out and go back to what was said. The divide out, go back to what was said, which makes it look redundant, is great if you've been given a proposition, you've been given something to agree with or not. John weighs 85 kilos, yes or no. But it doesn't work so well if there's a generalization in the offing. So supposing I said everything Einstein said was true, I don't tell you what Einstein said. All I tell you is that everything he said was true. But that means something. It means it's different than some of the things he said were false, which is the direct contradiction of it. So what's meant by saying everything Einstein said was true? And the idea is that the predicate is true gives you a way of bundling together things and discussing them without knowing exactly what was said. All you know is then that Einstein said something, and you can put it by saying either Einstein said that P and P, or Einstein said that Q and Q, or Einstein, or. So you've got an indefinitely large number of possibilities for what Einstein said. But whatever it was he said, I agree with it. That means that's when I say everything he said was true. And of course, other people might say, no, some of the things he said were not true. But I think it's in a way it's that you've got a sort of deferred content. You've got when you say everything he said was true, I'm not telling you what he said. I've deferred that to another occasion, let's say. But if you're confident in me, in my position, then when you hear what Einstein said that E equals mc squared. Oh, so E equals mc squared. And then you've got to agree with that, but maybe you need explaining what it means and so on. Einstein said that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light. That's interesting. Why did he say that? So you have to dive into relativity theory before you're in a position to agree or disagree with Einstein. But if your teacher, say, has told you everything Einstein said was true, you know that when you learn what he said, you also learn to agree with it. That is, you're not going to dissent from it. I'm not sure I've explained that very well, but it's, let's think of another example where people have thought there's a sort of substantive notion of truth, but there's not, or we don't think there's no need for one. Why does science work so well? Somebody says, oh gosh, look at the modern world. It's built on quantum theory, it's built on electronics and so on. Why do these things work so well? And somebody says, oh, it's because science gives us the truth. It's the truth of what science does that explains why scientific inventions work so well. Does that mean there's some special property that is involved, truth? The deflationist answer is no. Science doesn't give you a great big block of stuff. It gives you individual propositions about, in the case of quantum theory, what to expect. If you've got two entangled electrons and you make a measurement on one, you get the complementary measurement on the other. You can expect that. And that's one of the things that enables quantum theory to predict all kinds of results in these kind of systems people use it for, like electronic watches and things. In each individual case, you can divide through, as I put it. That is, you don't have to say truth is involved. You just have to say, well, science says that if you get this measurement on this particle, then you get that measurement on the other. And it turns out that if you make, in every case, if you make that measurement on this particle, you get that measurement on the other. The two are entangled. And that's just it. You've got to believe it. If you get that measurement, you get this measurement. But you don't need the notion of truth to say that. You just have to say, if you make this measurement, then you get this measurement. And science works because it says, if you make this measurement, then you get this measurement. And if you get this measurement, you do get that measurement. That's all. So again, truth divides out. And this is what the deflationist comes with. Again, the final example, which Horwich also gives, people sometimes say truth is normative, meaning that you ought to aim for the truth or believe the truth or only say the truth. So truth is normative. How does the deflationist explain that? Well, again, he says that's a generalization. If it's a generalization from if P, then you ought to say P. Or if P, then it's right to believe P. If you're inquiring whether P, then you ought to be sure that you get to the truth, would mean something like, if you're inquiring whether P, then you ought to believe P if and only if P. You can, again, divide out by the notion of truth. You don't need the notion of truth in that final sentence, but that's the sentence that gives you the norm. That is, when P, believe P. When not P, don't say P, and so on. So the idea of truth as a goal seems to sort of dissolve rather into a multitude of little propositions about having a goal that we don't say P when not P. And for various different substitutions of P, that can be more or less important. Very important not to say that John murdered his wife if John didn't murder his wife. Very important only to say that John murdered his wife if John did murder his wife. So there's the norm, and it can be important or very unimportant to say that what's unimportant? Very unimportant to say that it's raining in New York if it's not raining in New York. Well, actually, it doesn't much matter. I could be wrong about whether it's raining in New York without ruining my life, because I'm not in New York. If I was in New York, I'd want to know the weather, and it would be quite important to me to say it is raining, if and only if it's raining where we are. So the deflationist has a considerable armory of things he says. Now, let's get back to the point. What does deflationism have to do with quasi-realism, all that? Well, it means that once we've got the sentence, somebody's good or something is good or something is bad, we don't have an extra problem about the truth. You say that somebody's good if and only if you believe that he's good. You're right in saying that he's good. It's a different matter. You'd be right to say that he's good if and only if he, is indeed kind to his children and faithful to his wife and whatever else it is. But that's a question of your standards, which morality can be the same, whether or not. Sorry, it goes on the same way, whether or not your standards are one thing or another. So you're not laying your standards on the table when you say that John's a good man or whatever. But you will have standards for saying it. Otherwise, you can't expect a social agreement. And as I say, I think that's the point of moralizing.
So I have two things for you, Simon. One, of course, we could listen for an hour, and I would love to keep the conversation. But to end the interview today, I would love to have a message from you to the general public, if you don't mind, about the relevance of philosophy, since nowadays we have this insistence in technical knowledge and perhaps an critical worship of science alone by itself. And I'd love to hear from you that. And if you agree to have a second interview, perhaps with more challenging questions, perhaps in the future, to discuss more deeply about morality and language in general.
Right. Yes, the value of philosophy and perhaps of ethics in general. I've always thought that the best defense of philosophy comes again in Plato, in the Socratic dialogues. Socrates makes it plain that he's interested only in discussing issues. He's interested in discussing whether one thing or another is true, whether it's right to prosecute your father for a crime, whether it's right to supplant a hierarchical society of the democratic society. And he's interested in the advantages and disadvantages and so on. And Socrates slaps down people who would enter a dialogue with him, but who behave rather like Donald Trump and conduct it by just being rude. I mean, if you look at the quality of debate in the recent American election, it's completely childish. It would disappoint a teacher watching that kind of thing happen in a playground, because they just insult each other. And that's not the Socratic dialogue. The point about the Socratic dialogue is you put yourself open to challenge, and you make challenges. And your challenges have to be directed at whatever it is you're discussing, not at whether somebody's sensible or foolish. That may go by the side, but whether their points are ones you feel like accepting. And I think that's a very, very important message, because so much of the modern world, and you don't get this answer from science. You get the answer to scientific questions from science, of course, but you don't get the kind of ways to conduct debate just by listening to scientists. Sometimes the reverse, scientists can conduct debates very passionately and make lots of points which aren't relevant to what they're trying to show. They have their faults like everybody else. But I think an education which imbues people, which teaches people the value of open Socratic dialogue, is about as valuable as you can get. And if you look at the media, if you look at the way debate is conducted in public now, it's terribly disappointing. Plato actually, in I think it's book 7, towards the end of the Republic, gives a very pessimistic view of democracy. He thinks that the problem with democracy is going to be that, as it were, the loudest voice wins, and the promises, the democratic politician is always going to promise, and he's going to promise more than he can probably deliver. So there's a constant lie at the heart of it. Trump will say there's no global warming, so he can promise that America will thrive on, mining and cutting down natural resources and so on. And that's part of his appeal to lots of people. But it's childish. It goes along without any Socratic inquiry into the facts, into whether it's true that there's no global warming. So these are examples, I think, where the sheer structure of debate gets lost, the proper structure of debate, and sort of shouting matches take place instead. And I think it's a very important part of education. There are lots of people who've looked at philosophy in schools, and usually the results are very favorable. That is, children who've, as it were, learned to practice Socratic dialogue have a better sense of how to argue a case, how to parry an opponent's rival case, and so on, how to conduct planning, and eventually how to conduct their lives. So I think that's why people should study philosophy. Sorry, your other question was.
The second one is about a second interview, if you don't mind, in the future.
Oh yes, no, not at all. I love chatting about these things. The only problem is I sometimes go away feeling I haven't expressed myself as well as I would like.
Oh, you expressed it
pretty sorry?
Well. No, you
yeah.
Well, I try.
So it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. I hope it attracts some of your listeners.
Of course, it will.
Okay, good. And if you want another one, have to give me a rest for a month or two.
Of course. Next year.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the initiative.
Have a nice day.
Good.
Good.
Okay. Bye-bye now.
Bye.